The scent of ribs still lingered in the smoke as my son shoved me back from my own grill. Still, I steadied the tongs in my hand, pretending the metal didn't shake. As the charred sweetness clung to the air, I tasted every year I'd swallowed my pride. While the smoke curled around us, I realized this house had fed everyone but me. The same ribs he laughed over were the ones I'd marinated in silence. That's when I decided, tonight, he'd eat his last meal in a home with my name on the deed. All right, before we dive into this crazy story, do me a favor, subscribe and tell us where you're watching from. The afternoon sun hung low over the yard, casting long shadows across the grass, as Judith stood near the grill, flipping ribs with practiced ease. The smell of smoky meat mixed with the sharp tang of coleslaw, the lemonade sweet and tangy in the pitcher beside her. A perfect day for a cookout, if you ignored the tension simmering just under the surface. Colby had been drinking since noon, his loud laugh carrying over the clinking of glasses and the buzz of casual conversation. The man had a way of filling a room, or a backyard, with his presence. He and his wife, Janelle, had arrived late, as usual, bringing only a vague apology for being caught up. Judith had caught sight of their disapproving glance when she'd mentioned the ribs were ready. They always arrived late, leaving her to handle the heavy lifting. Today, however, there was something else in the air, a charge that Judith couldn't quite place, but could feel deep in her chest. She was just setting the last rack of ribs onto the platter when Colby sauntered over, a beer in hand, his eyes glinting like he'd had one too many already. "Get out of the way, old lady!" he barked, a slur in his words barely masked by his too wide grin. Judith stiffened, the heat of the grill reflecting the sudden cold of his tone. She'd heard worse, of course. Colby had always been like this, loud, dismissive, treating her like a relic of the past. The years had made her tough, used to the jabs, the dismissals, the dismissive chuckles that followed. But there was something today, something different, darker in the way he looked at her. Before she could respond, he shoved her. Hard. The impact sent Judith stumbling back against the sink, her hand scrambling for purchase on the counter as she barely caught herself. The clink of the silverware jar falling over was the only sound that broke through the stunned silence. Her chest tightened, not just from the shock of the shove, but from something deeper, a kind of humiliation she hadn't felt in years. The bruising feeling in her ribs was nothing compared to the way the laughter filled the air like a slap to her dignity. Janelle, who had been sipping her wine a few feet away, let out a sharp laugh. It was thin, the kind of laugh that doesn't reach the eyes. "Oh, come on, Judith, lighten up," she called, a grin playing at the edges of her mouth. It was just a joke. A few of the guests, who'd been watching the exchange, chuckled awkwardly, clearly unsure whether to join in or retreat. None of them spoke up, though, and that was what hurt the most. The silence of their complicity, the way they let it happen. Max, who had been sitting off to the side, his fingers loosely gripping his phone, froze. His face twisted with discomfort as his gaze flicked between his mother, grandmother, and the rest of the group. He opened his mouth, then closed it again, his voice rising above the din. "That wasn't funny," Max said, his voice clear, though unsure. There was no trace of amusement in his tone, just the raw edge of truth, cutting through the laughter. Judith's heart skipped. She knew Max was on the cusp of something, adulthood, rebellion, change. But hearing him speak up, seeing his disapproval, felt like a small, unexpected relief in the storm. He wasn't laughing. He wasn't going along with the charade. She straightened herself, her shirt now askew, her hand pressed against the counter as she silently righted it, smoothing out the wrinkles. Her skin was hot, burning from the anger that had started to rise in her chest, but she didn't let it show. Not yet. The silence lingered for a moment. No one knew how to react. No one knew whether to look at her, look away, or pretend they hadn't seen anything at all. Colby stood there looking almost surprised. Surprised that she hadn't laughed with them. Surprised she hadn't just let it go like she always did. Judith's eyes met his for the first time that day. Not in a fleeting glance, but full on, deliberate, with everything she had inside her. She didn't say a word, but the message was clear. No more. Her lips pressed into a thin line as she turned her back to him, focusing back on the grill, though her hands were shaking. The ribs had started to burn on one side, but she didn't care. Let it burn. As the guests continued their half-hearted conversations, as Colby and Janelle moved to the table to serve themselves, Judith felt the quiet rage building inside her. Something had snapped, like a string pulled too tight, and now, she couldn't unsee what had just happened. Her chest constricted, her breath shallow. She knew, in that moment, things could never go back to how they were. She was done. And by nightfall, she would make sure everyone else knew it too. But for now, she just focused on the grill, the flames, the smoke, the smell of burned meat, because it was the only thing that felt real at the moment. Judith stood in the dimly lit kitchen, the phone pressed to her ear. She stared at the photos of her home spread across the table, the edges curling slightly from the late afternoon humidity. Her fingers traced the corner of a family portrait she'd once hung above the mantel, before it became just another relic of a past life. The ribs she'd burned still sat on the counter, the smell of charred meat making her stomach churn. She hadn't tasted a bite. "Read," she said, her voice steady but low, as though speaking too loud might ruin the moment. "Is your quick close guy still around?" There was a pause on the other end of the line, the familiar rustle of papers as Reed adjusted himself. She could hear the faint clink of glass, maybe ice in a tumbler, maybe a coffee cup. He was always the type to make a deal while sitting in his office, a scotch in hand, like it was just another Tuesday. "If you're serious, I'll have him draw up the listing tonight," Reed finally replied, his voice gravelly from years of real estate deals and late nights. Judith's grip tightened on the phone, her nails biting into the plastic. Serious. She had never been more serious about anything in her life. "I am," she said simply, already knowing what she had to do. She crossed to the cluttered kitchen counter, rifling through a stack of papers until she found the photos she had printed the week before. A few quick clicks on her computer had given her all the data she needed. Square footage, layout, tax history. She'd kept it all, cataloged in neat, labeled binders for moments like this. Reed had seen her do this before. She'd always been the one to handle the paperwork, to organize, to manage. It was the one thing that kept her grounded, the last shred of control she had left in her world. But now, control wasn't just about managing files. It was about taking the only thing she could. The house. Her house. With a quick exhale, Judith sent over the files. "Sent," she said, her voice crisp. "All right, I'll get it started," Reed responded. "You sure about this?" She glanced at the framed photograph of Colby as a child, smiling in front of the house. It was almost impossible to reconcile the boy in that picture with the man who'd shoved her today. She felt a small surge of bile rise in her throat, but she swallowed it down. "Don't send it to me if you're not going to finish it," she replied. Reed paused again. This time it was longer. Longer than usual. She could almost hear the wheels turning in his head. He had a lot of clients. But this wasn't just any transaction. This was Judith. And he knew it was personal. "Judith, are you ready to lose them?" he asked, the question lingering between them. She didn't need to answer right away. The silence stretched long, and for a moment she wasn't sure how to respond. Was she ready to lose them? To lose Colby and Janelle? To sever all the ties that had once felt so permanent, so inescapable? The house was her last anchor, and cutting it loose would send ripples through everything. But then she thought of Colby's shove, the humiliation, the laughter, the way he'd treated her like nothing. She thought of the way he'd always dismissed her, how he'd always thought he could walk all over her. She'd been patient, she'd been accommodating, but she couldn't do it anymore. Not after today. "I'm ready," Judith said, her voice unwavering. The line clicked in her ear, and the call ended. Judith stood there for a moment longer, her phone now dead in her hand. She looked around the kitchen, her eyes scanning the space one last time. The house she'd raised her children in, the house where so many memories had been made. Now it was just a building. And the walls, once filled with laughter and joy, had turned into walls of confinement. Suddenly, the front door creaked open, and Judith's attention snapped to the sound. Georgia Pike appeared in the doorway, carrying her familiar thermos of coffee. Judith's best friend stepped into the room, a smile tugging at her lips. She was wearing her signature pearls and, as always, carrying her pepper spray in the small knitting bag slung over her shoulder. Georgia was tough, no nonsense, and always prepared. She was the kind of woman Judith needed right now. "Coffee's ready," Georgia said, setting the thermos down on the table. Her eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of the photos, the square footage sheets, the paperwork. "Looks like you've made up your mind." "I have," Judith replied, her gaze not leaving the pile of papers. "It's happening." Georgia nodded and pulled a chair out. She sat down with ease, folding her hands over her lap. Judith felt a slight shift in the air, as though she had just crossed a threshold she could never return from. The decision was final. There was no turning back now. Without another word, Georgia took out her notary seal from her bag and set it beside the stack of papers. It was time. "I'll get it notarized," Georgia said, her voice low and certain. "And we'll make sure this gets done." Judith looked at her, then back at the papers. "Get it on MLS by 8 a.m. tomorrow," she said, her voice still steady. But now, a cold fire burned beneath it. "We can't afford any delays." Georgia raised an eyebrow but didn't ask questions. She knew Judith better than anyone. This wasn't just a sale. This was something else. Something bigger. As Georgia began to set the papers in order, Judith felt a strange sense of calm come over her. She had made the call. And now, she had no choice but to see it through. Outside, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting long shadows across the yard. The cookout was still going on, the faint murmur of guests in the distance, but Judith knew the house wasn't hers anymore. It was already slipping away, and tomorrow, everyone would know. The house felt empty in a way it hadn't before. Judith wandered through the rooms, her eyes tracing the familiar corners, the kitchen, the living room, the stairs leading up to the bedrooms. She had lived here for decades, but tonight it all felt like someone else's life. The kitchen table was cluttered with papers and photos, the weight of the sale already sinking in her bones. She had made the call, sent the paperwork off, and now everything was moving forward faster than she could have imagined. The quick close deal she'd arranged with Reed was already in motion. 2 buyers had shown immediate interest, sight unseen, cash in hand. She couldn't help but feel a brief flash of satisfaction. That was how fast the world turned when you didn't blink. Judith sat down at the table, dialing Reed's number again, watching the streetlights flicker on outside the window. She had a feeling that by the time she woke up tomorrow, everything would be different. "Reed?" she said when he picked up. "I want to list it $20,000 under market. We need to move fast." There was a pause on the other end, followed by a soft chuckle. "Judith? You're serious, aren't you? Trying to start a bidding war already? I want it gone. Now. Before they change their minds." Judith replied, her tone flat but decisive. All right. I'll send the revised listing to the buyers. We'll make it happen." The line went quiet for a beat as Judith listened to the soft buzz of traffic outside, the world continuing on as if nothing had changed, even though everything had. The sound of the front door creaking open interrupted her thoughts. Judith looked up, spotting Georgia Pike entering the room, carrying her familiar thermos of coffee. It was a small comfort, the only thing in the world that felt like home at the moment. "You've got that look," Georgia said, setting the thermos down on the table before pulling up a chair. Her sharp eyes took in the papers, the listing agreement, the photos. "I'm ready," Judith replied, keeping her voice level. Georgia simply nodded, as if she'd been waiting for this moment. She reached into her bag and pulled out her notary seal, clicking it into place on the stack of documents. Without another word, she began stamping the papers one by one, each thud of the rubber seal a small, final declaration of intent. The clock on the wall ticked louder, its hands moving with deliberate slowness as the weight of the decision hung in the air. Judith's fingers twitched slightly, her body vibrating with the tension of what was to come. "Get it on MLS by morning," Judith murmured, her eyes scanning the papers before her. "No delays. I want it signed and finalized before anyone has a chance to second-guess me." Georgia looked up, the ghost of a smile tugging at her lips. "You're playing a dangerous game, you know. You're not just selling a house, you're closing a chapter." Judith's gaze hardened, and for a moment she didn't speak. She didn't need to. Georgia knew her well enough to read between the lines. This wasn't just about the house. This was about something far deeper. Something that could never be repaired. As Georgia finished the last document, Judith stood up, collecting the forms and sliding them into a manila envelope. The decision had been made, and there was no going back. The house was already slipping through her fingers like sand. Max came into the room just as she was gathering her things, his footsteps light on the hardwood floor. He paused in the doorway, watching her silently for a moment, his expression unreadable. The unease in his eyes had not escaped Judith's notice, and her stomach tightened. "Are we moving?" he asked, his voice quiet. Judith didn't look up immediately. She finished closing the envelope, the sound of paper folding sharp in the quiet room. When she finally raised her eyes to him, she saw the confusion in his face, the questions that had been left unanswered. "Just me," she replied, her voice steady but tinged with something he couldn't quite place. It wasn't cold, but it wasn't warm either. Max nodded, though his brow furrowed slightly, as if trying to understand. She could feel the weight of his gaze, but she didn't soften. She couldn't. Instead, she crossed to the bookshelf and began pulling a few items from the shelves. Books, keepsakes, little things that had gathered dust over the years. She packed them into a small box, her movements deliberate, as if marking the end of something. She didn't need them anymore. She had been patient, too patient. She had given and given, for years, and now it was time to take something for herself. Max's voice broke through her thoughts again. "But why?" Judith paused, the question hanging between them like a thread, taut and fragile. For a moment she considered explaining, telling him why she had to leave, why she had to sell the house. But she couldn't. She wouldn't. Not now. Because it wasn't just about the house anymore. Judith picked up the manila envelope, the weight of it in her hand solid and final. She held it in front of her for a moment before setting it down with a soft thud on the table. "I've updated my will," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And my living trust. The house is gone, and so am I." Max blinked, his expression unreadable, and for a brief moment Judith wondered if he understood. She turned away before he could say anything more, moving toward the back of the house, the sounds of her footsteps echoing in the empty hall. Outside, the sun had set completely, and the house was cloaked in shadows. Judith felt the air grow colder as she stepped out onto the back porch, the breeze a sharp reminder of everything she was leaving behind. The decision had been made, and by tomorrow, it would be done. There was no turning back now. Judith stood by the window, staring out at the yard. The house felt like it was holding its breath, the air thick with the tension of everything that had happened and everything that was about to unfold. She could see the faint flicker of lights in the distance from Colby and Janelle's truck. They'd just pulled in, and even though she hadn't heard their voices yet, she knew their arrival meant one thing. Things were about to get harder. Her phone buzzed in her hand. It was a text from Janelle. "You're being ridiculous. Come on, it's just a joke." Judith's lips pressed together. Disrespect isn't playful, it's practiced. She typed it out quickly, her fingers steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. She didn't hesitate before hitting send. Almost immediately, Janelle's reply appeared. "What's your problem?" "He was just messing around. You need to get over it." Judith stared at the screen, her thumb hovering over the keyboard, a wave of frustration rising in her chest. She could almost hear Janelle's voice in her head, all sweetness and smiles on the surface, but underneath it was always the same sneer of condescension. It wasn't playful. It was a way of keeping her in her place. Before she could respond, the sound of the front door creaking open broke her train of thought. Judith turned, her heart quickening in her chest. Colby and Janelle were standing in the doorway, their postures stiff, their faces blank masks that told her everything and nothing all at once. Colby spoke first, his tone flat. "I saw your message." "I don't want to hear it," Judith replied, her voice cold but steady. "This isn't about your joke. It's about what I've had enough of." He looked at her for a long moment, the silence stretching between them like a taut wire. Then, as if shrugging off the weight of the conversation, he turned to Janelle and muttered, "Whatever, let's go grab a drink." Janelle, however, stood there, eyeing Judith with something between amusement and disdain. "You're really doing this, aren't you?" Judith's gaze didn't waver. "It's done." Georgia, who had been quietly sitting in the living room, watching the exchange from a distance, stood up from the armchair. She moved with the quiet authority of someone who had seen 1,000 similar scenes, who knew what was coming next. "Judith's not joking, Janelle," Georgia said, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "She's done being the punching bag." Janelle's face twisted in a flicker of anger, but it was gone as quickly as it had appeared, replaced with that same sugary smile. "It's fine," she said, her voice saccharine. "It's just a house, right? We'll find somewhere else to live. No big deal." Judith clenched her fists at her sides, the weight of what was happening, what had already happened, sinking deep into her chest. "It's not about the house, Janelle. It's about respect. And I haven't had any of that from either of you for years." She could see the way Janelle's smile faltered, the way her shoulders tensed as if the words had struck her like a physical blow. She was trying to hide it, to brush it off, but it was there. The unease, the fear that Judith might actually be serious this time, and she was. "I'm done with this," Judith said, her voice growing quieter but no less resolute. "You'll have 30 days, you can figure it out then, but I'm selling the house." She turned her back to them then, walking toward the kitchen, her steps measured, deliberate. Colby and Janelle didn't follow. They couldn't. They were already retreating, defeated without a word, knowing that any response they gave now would only make it worse. Georgia followed her into the kitchen, her footsteps light but full of purpose. "We've got the offer letter," Georgia said, pulling out the papers from her bag. "Full asking price. Just like you wanted." Judith glanced down at the document, her heart racing in her chest. The price was right. The offer was solid. She didn't have to wait for approval from Colby or Janelle. This was happening. The house would be gone, and so would everything it had come to represent. "Send it back," Judith said, taking the letter and signing it with a flourish. "Close it in 10 business days, no delays." Georgia raised an eyebrow. You're serious about the appraisal under Colby's name, then? Judith's lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile. Just to watch him panic. Georgia didn't smile, but there was a gleam of approval in her eyes. That's the spirit. As Judith slid the papers into the envelope and handed them over to Georgia, she couldn't help but feel a small rush of satisfaction. The deal was done. There was no turning back now. The house was no longer a home. It was just a deal. Another transaction. And she was in control. She stepped back from the counter and looked around one last time, as if she were trying to imprint every detail on her memory. The worn floors, the old family photos, the smell of coleslaw still lingering in the air from the cookout. It was all fading into a past that didn't belong to her anymore. Max had been quiet during the entire exchange, standing in the doorway watching them. When she turned to face him, he didn't speak at first. He didn't have to. His eyes said everything. And in that moment, Judith understood. He wasn't angry. He wasn't upset. He was just waiting. Waiting to see if she would finally stop being the woman who always gave. And in the silence that followed, Judith knew. She had. The weight of the decision still heavy on her shoulders, she turned back to the table where the offer letter waited, the ink already dry on a future she had chosen for herself. Tomorrow, the appraisal would be under Colby's name. And by then, he would know the truth. This time, she wouldn't just be the one pushed aside. Judith sat at the kitchen table, her fingers tapping the edge of her coffee cup. The house felt unnaturally quiet, the hum of the outside world muted by the looming weight of what was about to happen. She had made the decision. It was done. She had secured the sale, signed the contract, and set the wheels in motion. In a few short days, this house, her home, would belong to someone else. Her phone buzzed again, another message from Reed confirming the inspection time. The buyers were still ready. Inspection at 10. Be there. Judith glanced toward the front door. The morning was crisp, a pale light filtering through the windows, casting soft shadows on the worn hardwood floors. She had been here so many years, but now everything felt like it belonged to someone else. Someone who wasn't her. A loud knock at the door shattered the stillness. Judith's heart quickened and she stood, smoothing her blouse. There was no turning back now. She could hear Colby and Janelle moving through the house, their footsteps heavy and uncertain, still processing the fact that she had sold the place out from under them. Judith wasn't sure what they expected. The house wasn't going to magically stay theirs. They'd never gotten that through their thick skulls. Janelle answered the door, her usual cool demeanor slipping into confusion as she looked at the home inspector standing on the doorstep. He was a nondescript man in his 40s, with a clipboard in his hands and a set of keys hanging from his belt. His jacket was unbuttoned, revealing a plain gray shirt beneath. The kind of man who looked like he could blend into any background, but the kind of man Judith had carefully selected for just this moment. Janelle glanced over her shoulder at Judith, who had stepped into the hallway, watching them. She looked back at the inspector with a slight frown. Can I help you?" Janelle asked, clearly not expecting him. "I'm here for the inspection," the man replied with a dull professionalism, holding up his clipboard. "I'm assuming Judith's expecting me?" "Judith," Janelle began, but Judith was already moving toward the door. "Please give them space," Judith said calmly, stepping past Janelle and meeting the inspector's gaze. "This is part of the process." Janelle looked like she was about to protest but caught herself, her lips pressed into a thin line. She clearly didn't want to be involved any further than she had to be. Colby's voice echoed from the back of the house, sharp and disbelieving. "What process?" Judith turned to face him. He was standing in the hallway, arms crossed, his face a mixture of confusion and irritation, his eyes locked on her as he took a few heavy steps toward her. "The sale," Judith said quietly, her voice unwavering. "The house is sold. We're just completing the inspection." Colby blinked, as if the words hadn't quite registered. Then a hollow laugh escaped him. "You're bluffing. There's no way you're actually going through with this." Judith felt a small, quiet satisfaction in the pit of her stomach. She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "You bet your house I'm not." The words hung in the air between them, a declaration that finally broke through Colby's bravado. His face twisted into a scowl, but there was a flicker of doubt in his eyes. He had always underestimated her, always assumed that, in the end, she would cave, or that she didn't have the spine to follow through. But Judith wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not after everything. Georgia entered the room just as Colby opened his mouth to retort, her presence filling the space with quiet authority. She looked at Colby and Janelle for a moment, her lips barely curling into a smile before she turned to Judith. "The buyer's contract is good," Georgia said, sliding a folder across the table where Judith had been sitting. "They're still in for the full asking price." Judith glanced at the contract, her hand brushing over it before she closed the folder with deliberate care. She could feel Colby's eyes on her, burning with disbelief. Colby stared at her for a moment longer, then snorted, stepping back as though he could somehow distance himself from the reality of the situation. "You can't just sell the house," he muttered. "It's not that easy." Judith's gaze was sharp as she held his stare, her words steady. "I can do whatever I want with it. I've already signed the papers. The house is as good as gone. You can pack up, or you can keep pretending this is your home." Colby's jaw tightened, his hands clenching into fists. The room seemed to shrink around them, the tension thick as smoke. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. Behind him, Janelle still stood in the doorway, her arms crossed, her expression unreadable. But Judith saw the flicker in her eyes, the brief realization that this wasn't a game, that her position was crumbling in front of her. The house was no longer their territory. It was hers to give away. 30 days, Judith said, her voice final, a warning now wrapped in resignation. "That's all you have." Max, who had been silently observing from the hallway, stepped forward then, his face a mixture of confusion and sadness. "Grandma," he began, his voice tentative, "are we really leaving?" Judith met his gaze, and for a moment, the weight of it all seemed to hang between them. Her heart twisted at the sight of him, her grandson, who had watched the unraveling of his family and yet remained silent, never once laughing at the pain. She took a slow, deliberate breath, holding his gaze with a quiet strength. "Yes, Max," she said softly. "We're leaving." And as she said it, Judith knew that when the appraisal came in under Colby's name, when the buyers confirmed the deal, it would be more than just the house changing hands. It would be the final, irrevocable step in letting go of a past that had never truly been hers to begin with. She wasn't just closing a door, she was slamming it shut for good. The sun was just beginning to rise, casting a soft golden hue over the kitchen as Judith sat at the table, her pen in hand, carefully drafting the official notice. Her hand moved slowly but with precision, each stroke of the pen sealing the inevitable. The words came easily to her, practiced, like they had been in her mind for years. "This is to notify you that you are required to vacate the premises within 30 days. Failure to comply will result in legal action." She paused for a moment, her eyes scanning the paper. This was the part she had dreaded. The final step in severing the last of the ties that had bound her to Colby and Janelle. But as she looked at the notice, she felt no hesitation. It had to be done. There was no more room for second chances. She folded the paper and grabbed a magnet from the fridge, walking over to the doorway where the others still lingered. Colby and Janelle were in the living room, huddled together on the couch, both of them stewing in their own resentment. Max had gone quiet since the last conversation, retreating into the silence of his own confusion. Judith placed the notice on the fridge, letting the magnet snap it into place. She stepped back, taking a moment to let the words sink in. It was real now. More real than ever. Janelle, who had been pretending to scroll through her phone, glanced up at the notice with a flicker of disbelief. Her eyes widened, and she quickly stood up, walking to the fridge. "You can't do this," Janelle said sharply, her fingers gripping the edge of the notice. "You can't just kick us out, Judith." Judith didn't flinch, didn't back down. She knew this moment was coming. She had prepared for it. "I already did," Judith replied evenly, pulling the deed from the pocket of her cardigan. She opened it slowly, the paper cracking slightly as she slid it across the kitchen counter toward Janelle. "It's done. The house is sold, and you've got 30 days. Janelle's face went pale as she read the deed. Her mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, her words caught somewhere between rage and disbelief. "This is insane!" Janelle spat, the shaking in her voice betraying her anger. "You don't get to decide this for all of us. This is still our home?" Judith's eyes hardened. She had heard it all before. The manipulation, the insistence that this was still their home, their family. But it wasn't. Not anymore. Not after everything. "No," Judith said quietly, her voice steady. "It's mine. And it always was." Behind them, Max stood in the doorway, watching the scene unfold in front of him. He had been quiet all morning, his eyes filled with something Judith couldn't quite read. He shifted uncomfortably, his gaze flicking between the confrontation and Judith. "Grandma," Max said, his voice small, uncertain. "Can I still visit you?" The question was so simple, so innocent, it felt like a punch to the gut. Judith turned to him, her heart aching at the rawness of the moment. She swallowed hard, willing herself to stay composed. "Of course, Max," she said, her voice softening, the first real warmth breaking through the tension. "You're always welcome. This doesn't change that." He nodded, looking as though the weight of everything, the house, the notice, the family, was pressing down on him. Judith could see it in his eyes. The boy had grown up in this house, watched as everything around him slowly cracked, but he wasn't yet old enough to fully understand the depth of what was happening. Georgia stepped into the room then, holding a small black device in her hand. Judith's gaze flicked to the Ring camera she had been setting up above the front porch. "Thought we might need a little extra security," Georgia said, her voice dry, but there was a certain satisfaction in her tone as she attached the camera to the wall. "Better safe than sorry." Judith didn't say anything. She hadn't asked for the camera, but she knew Georgia was right. It wasn't just about keeping an eye on the house. It was about control. The control Judith had been slowly and methodically reclaiming for herself. Janelle stood silently now, still holding the deed in her hand, her fingers clenched tightly around it. She was trying to piece together the situation, to fight against something that was no longer within her power to change. "This isn't over," she muttered, though her voice lacked the conviction it once had. Judith didn't respond. She didn't need to. The silence that followed spoke louder than any words could. She crossed to the boxes stacked neatly in the corner of the room. The china that had once been displayed proudly in the cabinets, the plates Colby had always used to serve his food, the cups that had been passed from hand to hand at holiday meals. All of it, carefully wrapped and packed, each piece labeled with a note. Not theirs. She picked up one of the smaller boxes and looked at it for a long moment. It was as though she was wrapping up a lifetime's worth of memories, sealing them away for good. Judith's fingers lingered over the tape, a faint sense of finality settling deep within her. Max watched her with the same unreadable expression, his lips pressed together. She caught his eye and gave him a small nod. "Go ahead," she said, her voice firm but filled with an unexpected tenderness. "Take your time. But when you're ready, we'll be moving on." Max's lips trembled for a moment, but he nodded and slowly stepped into the hallway. Judith let him go, her gaze lingering on the empty space where their family had once gathered. The door was closing. She was closing it, finally, for good. And with it, she was walking away from a life she had given everything to, leaving behind the ashes of what could never be rebuilt. Outside, the wind was beginning to pick up, and the branches of the trees swayed. The camera whirred to life, silently observing, and Judith felt a quiet thrill of control, the kind she hadn't felt in years. Her house, her future, and no one could take that away. The knock on her bedroom door was loud, desperate. Judith had just finished taping the last of the boxes, the weight of her actions still heavy in the air. She wasn't ready for this. Not now. Not after everything she'd done to get to this point. But she had known it would come. The resistance, the anger, the attempts to break her resolve. Colby was nothing if not persistent when he wanted something. The knock came again, followed by Colby's voice. Sharp and trembling with barely contained rage. "You're breaking up the family!" he yelled from the other side of the door, his voice a mixture of accusation and frustration. "You can't just do this. You don't get to destroy everything." Judith sat perfectly still on her bed, her fingers clenched tightly around the edge of the cardboard box she had just sealed. It was the last of the china she had inherited from her mother, the only thing she'd ever truly cared about keeping. She looked at it for a moment before standing, her movements slow and deliberate, before she crossed the room and opened the door. Colby was standing there, wild-eyed, his face flushed red with anger. His fists were clenched at his sides, and the anger radiating off him was palpable. "You don't get to tear this family apart," he continued, his voice shaking now with something that bordered on desperation. "We built this life together, and you're just throwing it away? What about Max? What about him, huh?" Judith's gaze didn't waver, her expression unreadable. "This isn't about family anymore, Colby. This is about respect. And you've never given me any." He recoiled, the words striking a chord, but he recovered quickly, his gaze turning colder. "You think this is the right thing to do? Just sell the house and move on with your life? You're ruining everything." Judith's hand tightened on the doorframe. She wanted to slam it in his face, but she knew that would only escalate things. She had to stay calm, stay controlled. "This is what I want," she said, her voice steady but firm. "I've been patient for years, but not anymore. I'm done waiting for you to change, Colby. You've made it clear how little you think of me." For a long moment, he said nothing, just stared at her, his chest rising and falling with each labored breath. Then, with a final defeated snarl, he turned and stormed off down the hall, his footsteps echoing through the empty house. Judith closed the door behind her, locking it this time. She leaned against it for a moment, exhaling slowly, allowing herself a small moment of relief. But she knew it wouldn't last. A few minutes later, Janelle appeared in the hallway, her heels clicking sharply on the floor. She didn't even knock. She just opened the door, her face set in an expression of icy contempt. "You've really done it now," Janelle said, her voice low but no less cutting. "I'm going to take you to court, you know. You think you can just throw us out like this? It's not legal." Judith didn't even flinch. "Go ahead," she replied, her tone hardening. "If you want to waste your time and money on that, be my guest. But the house is sold, and the deal is final. You have 30 days. Janelle's eyes narrowed, and for a moment, Judith thought she might actually make a scene. But instead, Janelle just scoffed and turned on her heel, muttering something under her breath. Judith didn't care. She had made her decision. With a quiet sigh, she reached for her phone and dialed George's number. The line clicked, and after a few seconds, her best friend's familiar voice came through. "Georgia, Tell Reed I need the final paperwork couriered today. I want this closed now. No more waiting. She could hear the hesitation in George's voice, even through the line. Are you sure, Judith? Once it's final, there's no turning back. I've been sure for a long time, Judith replied, her voice resolute. It's done. After hanging up, she walked across the room, her eyes scanning the space around her. There wasn't much left. The house had become little more than a collection of empty rooms and fading memories. She crossed the room to the closet and began carefully packing her things. The photos, the trinkets, the pieces of a life she was about to leave behind. By the time she finished, the house was a skeleton of what it had been. All that remained were a few pieces of furniture, some personal items, and her. The day was slipping away, and with it, the last of her ties to this place. Later, when Judith made her way downstairs to check on Max, she found him sitting in the living room. He had his legs tucked under him, staring out the window. He didn't say anything when she entered the room, but she saw the quiet worry in his eyes. Are you okay? She asked softly, sitting beside him. Max didn't look at her, but his voice was small. Why are we leaving, Grandma? Why can't we just stay here? Judith's heart clenched at the question. She wanted to explain, to make him understand, but the truth was more complicated than he could ever grasp. He wasn't ready for the full weight of what was happening. He only saw the house. He couldn't see the years of neglect, the disrespect, the manipulation. Because it's time, she said, her voice soft but sure. This house isn't ours anymore. It hasn't been for a long time. Max nodded, his eyes still fixed on the window. Judith reached over and squeezed his shoulder. He looked up at her, his face a mixture of confusion and acceptance. You're doing the right thing, he whispered. The words hit her harder than she expected. Judith's breath caught in her throat, and for the first time in weeks, the tears came. Not for what she was losing, but for everything she had fought to protect. For Max. For herself. She cried then, the tears flowing freely, but she didn't stop. Because for the first time in a long time, Judith knew she was finally free. The knock on the door was soft, almost tentative, but Judith knew exactly what it was. She had been waiting for it. Every second of every minute since the sale had begun to feel like an eternity. She didn't hesitate. Her hands were steady as she stood from the chair, the same chair she had sat in for so many years, and crossed the room to answer it. Reed's assistant stood there, holding a leather folder in one hand. The man was young, unremarkable, but the official weight of the packet in his grasp made his presence feel much more important than it probably was. He wasn't here for pleasantries. He wasn't here to talk. He was here to finalize it all. Ms. Malone, he said, giving her a brief nod as he handed over the folder. Everything's in order. Just need your signature on the final documents. Judith took the folder without a word, opening it on the spot. The first page was a blur of text. Legal terms, clauses, conditions. Her eyes skimmed through it with practiced ease. She had read contracts like this before, over and over. The deal had been set, the house sold, and now it was just a formality. The weight of it all, though, hung heavy in her chest. It felt real now. The end. The finality. Georgia stood beside her, her presence like a quiet anchor in the storm. She didn't say anything, just watched Judith carefully as she slid the first sheet of paper into place, her pen moving in a smooth, fluid motion. She signed. The next sheet. Another signature, the words becoming less important with every passing page. Every stroke of the pen solidified the distance between Judith and the family she had spent so many years building. She felt the sharp pull of finality in her chest, but she didn't stop. Not now. She signed. The pages blurred together as Judith moved through them, the transaction slipping into place like the final pieces of a puzzle she had been too scared to finish. Each signature was a small exhale, a small letting go, and yet it felt like she was closing something she had once desperately clung to. Finally, the last page. She signed it with a faint, almost imperceptible sigh. The house was gone. Her home. The one she had fought for. The one that had seen her through everything. The ink dried on the final document, sealing her fate. She passed the folder back to Reed's assistant without a second thought. "Thank you, Ms. Malone," he said, already turning toward the door. But then he paused, glancing back at her. "The money will be wired in 48 hours. You'll have it then." Judith nodded, her eyes hardening. She didn't need the money, not like they thought she did. She didn't need any of this, not anymore. She had made her decision. As Reed's assistant left, Judith took a deep breath, walking slowly across the room. She felt lighter now, but it was a weightless feeling that had come at a high price. She crossed to the desk, where her bank statements sat neatly stacked. She opened the drawer and retrieved the forms she had been preparing all morning. She updated her bank account, changed the beneficiary on her trust, adjusted her will. She didn't hesitate as she erased the home from her documents, from her life. It wasn't hers anymore. It had never truly been hers for the past 2 decades, but now it was a matter of letting go, of cutting the final thread. The house would never be her anchor again. It had been too long coming. She had spent so many years trying to fill a void with it, trying to make it work, but it had never been a home in the way it was supposed to be. Now it was just a building, and she was walking away from it. She took the final step of the process with precision, checking everything off. No more thinking, no more waiting. Later that night, as she finished packing her last box of personal effects, there was another knock on the door. This time, she knew exactly who it was. Colby. He had come for one last confrontation, the same way he had when he first shoved her in front of the guests. It was his way of trying to make her second-guess herself, of forcing her into guilt. She felt the old anger bubble up, but she didn't let it show. She opened the door, her eyes meeting his without hesitation. Colby stood there, his face flushed, the tension in his posture clear. He had clearly been drinking, his words slurring slightly as he spoke. "This isn't over, Judith," he said, his voice thick with frustration. "You're breaking up the family, you're ruining everything. You can't just take this from us." Judith didn't flinch. She stood tall, her hands steady by her sides. She had done the hard work of cutting ties. Now it was just the final words. "I kept the lights on for 20 years, she said calmly, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "You'll keep them off in 30 days. For a moment, there was a flicker of something in Colby's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief. But the words didn't register immediately. He opened his mouth to argue again, but Judith stepped back into the house and closed the door behind her without a second glance. She didn't need to hear the rest. Colby's voice was muffled behind the door, but she didn't care anymore. It was over. She was done. And by tomorrow, he would understand. She had no more room for him. The air was thick with the sound of moving boxes, the scraping of packing tape, the faint hum of the refrigerator pulling its last breath. Judith stood in the middle of the living room, her eyes scanning the empty space that had once been filled with so much noise, so much life. Now there was only silence. She heard the neighbors talking outside, the usual chatter, but today it felt different. They were curious. They had been for days since the "for sale" sign had gone up in the front yard. Judith could hear the faint voices getting louder as they gathered by the sidewalk, their curiosity driving them closer to the house. A knock on the door broke the quiet, but Judith didn't need to answer it. She knew who it was. "Judith," came the voice from outside. "What's going on? We heard you sold the house. Is everything okay?" It was Mrs. Granger from next door, a woman who had lived in the neighborhood almost as long as Judith. Her voice was gentle, concerned, but also a little too full of questions. Judith opened the door, her gaze steady. Mrs. Granger stood there, her arms crossed, an expression that mixed pity with curiosity. "Just finally moving forward," Judith said, with a soft smile that didn't reach her eyes. It was the same line she'd been using for days, the only one that seemed to settle the questions without inviting more. Mrs. Granger frowned but nodded. "Well, it's a shame. This was such a nice neighborhood. I'm sorry it's come to this." Judith didn't respond. What was there to say? She wasn't sorry. She wasn't going to apologize for making a decision that had taken her years to come to. No, she wasn't sorry at all. She stepped back into the house, leaving Mrs. Granger standing on the porch. The neighbors could gossip, speculate, even pity her. But Judith didn't care anymore. The decisions had been made. The house was gone. And the last thing she was going to do was explain herself to people who hadn't been there for the years of neglect, the constant disrespect, the quiet, suffocating burden of it all. Inside, the sounds of moving continued. Colby and Janelle were gone now, holed up in their small corner of the house, their frustration palpable, but nothing they said could get to Judith anymore. They could be angry, they could try to fight, but the truth had already settled in. They were leaving. There was no other option. But even as they retreated into their own corner of the house, their future uncertain, Judith knew there was something else happening. The house was emptying, but so was her own life. She had been surrounded by noise for so long, the clamor of Colby's dismissive voice, the clink of glass as he poured his drinks, the whispered conversations that never seemed to be about her. Now, the silence in the house was her own. She moved through the rooms, her hands moving automatically, packing boxes, organizing what little she had left. Her eyes lingered on the photo frames she'd stacked on the dining table. Family photos, memories of a time when things had felt more whole. She hadn't looked at them in years. Max walked into the room quietly, his small figure carrying more weight than it should have. He had been packing his things too, in silence, and Judith watched him for a moment, her heart twisting. "Grandma," he said, breaking the silence. "Are you really leaving?" Judith gave him a soft smile, her voice steady despite the ache in her chest. "Yes, Max. I am." He nodded, the weight of her words hanging between them like a fragile thread. "Can I still visit you?" "Of course you can," she replied. "You're always welcome wherever I go." Max hesitated, then went back to packing, moving slower than usual. Judith turned her back to him, unable to watch him quietly slip away. She had known this would happen. The house had been a place of confusion for him too, a place where the tension was always in the air, even when no one spoke about it. She made her way to the kitchen, where Georgia was helping organize the last of the boxes. There was a list on the counter, a moving checklist that Georgia had put together to make sure everything was accounted for. Judith glanced at it, appreciating the quiet efficiency with which her friend worked. She didn't ask questions, didn't push. She simply moved forward with Judith. No hesitation, no judgment. "Is everything packed?" Judith asked, her voice calm but with a trace of exhaustion. Georgia nodded. "Almost. Just a few things left. You're sure about this?" Judith looked around the room one last time, her eyes lingering on the spot where the family dining table had once been, where laughter and arguments and memories had filled the air. But now it was just another room in an empty house. "I'm sure," Judith said, her voice firm. "It's done." At that moment, the front door opened and Janelle stepped into the hallway, her face tight with suppressed anger. "You're hurting Max," she said, her voice cutting through the quiet, laced with guilt and accusation. Judith's jaw tightened, but she didn't rise to the bait. She had heard it all before. The guilt trips, the attempts to make her feel responsible for everyone else's happiness. But she wasn't responsible anymore. Not for them. Not for Colby. Not for anyone but herself. "I'm not hurting Max," Judith replied evenly, looking Janelle in the eye. Max will be fine. You, on the other hand, you've got 30 days. Janelle's face reddened with fury, but she didn't say anything else. She turned and stormed back into the living room. Judith didn't flinch. Instead, she turned back to the list, crossing off the final tasks as they were completed. The checklist, like everything else, was almost finished. The house was slipping away, and as the last box was packed, Judith couldn't shake the sense that this was the beginning of something new. Something she couldn't quite name, but that was finally hers. And when Colby came back, knocking on her door again, he wouldn't be able to stop it. Not anymore. Judith stood in the doorway of her new home, looking out over the quiet street. The small townhome, nestled on a tree-lined block in downtown Boise, was a far cry from the sprawling house she had just left behind. It was small, modest, and simple, but it was hers. Her name was already on the lease, and everything inside was prepaid. There were no worries about rent or bills for months to come. She stepped inside, taking in the room. The beige walls were bare for now, but she could already picture the place slowly filling up with the memories she was creating anew. It was quiet here, a stark contrast to the ever-present noise in the house she had spent decades in. She could still feel the ghosts of her past there. The clink of Colby's glass, the sound of Janelle's sharp voice cutting through the silence. But here, there was only peace. The space was modest but functional. A simple couch, a coffee table, a few shelves for her books. She set a box on the floor and began unpacking her things, her movements slow and deliberate. Her books, her plants, her framed copy of the deed to the house, the one that she had carried with her for years, a reminder of all she had worked for and all she had lost. It was a little thing, but she placed it on the windowsill, letting it catch the light. Just as it had in the house before. She had done it. She had finally let go. The doorbell rang, and Judith's gaze flicked toward the door, a faint smile tugging at her lips. She already knew who it was. Georgia stood there, holding a basket of muffins in one hand and a welcome mat in the other. She was a woman of small gestures, but Judith had learned that these gestures often meant more than any grand statement. "Wipe feet, keep respect," Georgia said with a wry grin as she handed Judith the basket. The words were simple but full of weight, and Judith felt a wave of warmth spread through her. Georgia had been with her through all of this. She was the one person who understood. "I love it," Judith said, accepting the mat. She placed it by the door, her hands lingering on the edge for a moment longer than necessary, taking in the quiet of the space. "It's perfect." Georgia didn't say anything else. She didn't need to. She set the basket of muffins on the kitchen counter and crossed to the windowsill, where Judith had placed the deed. She picked it up and gave Judith a look, a small but approving nod. "Well, you've done it," Georgia said softly, though her words were laced with something deeper. "I knew you would. It's a whole new chapter now." "I'm ready for it," Judith replied, her voice steady, though there was an undeniable lightness in her chest that hadn't been there before. "I'm ready for something new." Georgia was silent for a moment, but Judith could feel her steady gaze on her. Then, Georgia reached into her bag and pulled out a small card, handing it to Judith. "Something for the new place," she said. "A fresh start." Judith smiled, opening the card. Inside was a small drawing of a house, but it wasn't just any house. It was a home, with a bright sun above and a tree beside it, its roots solid and strong. Judith smiled at the simplicity of it, but the warmth that flooded her heart was anything but simple. "Thank you," she said softly, slipping the card into her pocket. There was a moment of quiet, the kind that only true friends can share. But then, Georgia broke the silence with a teasing glint in her eye. "So, what's next?" Judith looked out the window, the sun now setting, casting an amber glow across the street. Her gaze softened, and she sighed, feeling the weight of everything she had left behind. "I don't know yet," she said, turning back to Georgia. "But I'm going to find out." That night, as Judith unpacked the last of her boxes, her phone buzzed with an email. It was from Reed. Her eyes narrowed as she read the subject line, "Formal complaint from Colby Malone." The email itself was short, but the tone was unmistakable. Colby had sent a formal complaint to the title office, claiming that the sale was conducted improperly, that Judith had violated some sort of unwritten family agreement. His words were sharp, bitter, but they held no real weight. Judith knew it was only an attempt to regain control over something he had no claim to anymore. She sat at the small desk in her new home, the faint sound of traffic humming outside the window. Judith hit reply, typing only one line. Everything was clean. Reed had made sure of it. She hit send and closed her laptop, feeling the satisfaction of a clean break settle in. As she sat back in the chair, she heard the soft ping of her phone again. This time, it was from Max. She opened the message, her heart tightening when she saw the photos. It was a picture of his new room. Small, but neat. The walls bare except for a few pictures he had drawn. The bed was made, the desk tidy. A small plant sat by the window just like the one Judith had in hers. He had settled in. It was a small thing, but it meant more than anything. Judith smiled softly, fingers hovering over the keyboard as she typed, "I'm proud of you, Max. You're always welcome here." Max's reply came almost instantly. "Thanks, Grandma. I miss you. Love you." Judith closed her phone and exhaled, the weight of everything settling into the quiet of the room. For the first time in years, she felt like she was finally starting over. And this time, it was hers. Judith sat at her small kitchen table, the silence in the room settling around her like a warm blanket. The evening had fallen quietly, and the dim light from the overhead fixture cast long shadows over the counters, where only the bare essentials remained. She could hear the soft hum of the refrigerator and the occasional rustle of the wind outside. Everything was still. Everything was hers. But the envelope on the table in front of her caught her attention. She had seen it earlier that evening, but had deliberately avoided opening it. The familiar handwriting, the cold reminder of the past, was all too much. Now, with a deep breath, she picked it up and tore the flap open, pulling out the card inside. It was from Colby and Janelle. She could feel her heart tighten in her chest before she even looked at it. The front of the card was a simple design, a picture of a house with a warm light spilling from the windows, a family standing in front. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a plea. It was guilt dressed up in pretty words, a way to say, "We're sorry," without actually saying it. The inside was filled with words Judith had read too many times in the past, pleas for forgiveness, promises of change, and the same manipulative tone she'd always been subjected to. She read the first few lines and then stopped. Her fingers trembled slightly, and for a moment, she let the words sink in. "We're sorry for everything. We didn't mean for things to get this way. We wish you'd given us more time. You're hurting us and hurting Max. Please reconsider." Her jaw tightened as she read, but she didn't flinch. She wasn't surprised. The attempt to manipulate, to make her feel responsible for their pain, was so familiar it almost seemed routine. She had been the one to hold the family together for too long, and now they were trying to make her feel guilty for finally cutting the cord. Judith didn't let herself linger over it. With a quick motion, she slid the card into her shredder. The sound of it slicing through the paper was sharp, almost cathartic. She didn't need this. She didn't need their guilt. She had made her choice. Georgia, who had been sitting at the counter sipping her coffee quietly, watched her for a moment. The silence between them was comfortable, but it wasn't lost on Judith that Georgia understood this moment better than anyone else. She had been the one to sit with her, to listen, to support her when it felt like no one else could. Georgia raised an eyebrow, the smallest trace of curiosity in her expression. "Did you keep the return address?" Judith didn't even look at her as she grabbed the shredder, now full of shredded paper. "Why give them the satisfaction?" she replied coolly, her voice steady but laced with a quiet finality. Georgia didn't respond, just nodded and took another sip of her coffee. They didn't need words. The past was gone, and there was no use in dwelling on it anymore. The rest of the night passed in quiet comfort. Judith made dinner and they ate together in the small kitchen, the kind of meal that felt like it belonged to a completely different life. There was no loud arguing, no angry silences, no Colby hovering over the table with his drink in hand. It was just the two of them, eating calmly, talking occasionally, but mostly just enjoying the peace. Later, as the dishes were cleared and the kitchen became quiet again, there was another knock at the door. Judith's first instinct was to ignore it, but she knew who it was before the sound of the knock even reached her ears. She smiled softly to herself, rising from the chair. Max stood in the doorway, his face a little more grown up than it had been the last time she saw him, but still with the softness of a child who wasn't quite ready to leave behind his innocence. He held a small piece of paper in his hands, carefully folded. "Grandma," he said, his voice quiet but warm. "I drew you something." Judith stepped aside to let him in, a smile tugging at her lips. "What is it?" she asked, kneeling down to his level. Max handed her the small drawing, his eyes hopeful, as if he was unsure whether she would like it or not. The drawing was simple but perfect. It was a picture of a house, with a tree beside it, the sun shining brightly in the sky. It wasn't just any house, it was their house, the one that had always been filled with both love and pain, the one that had seen so many moments of joy, but so many moments of hurt too. But in Max's drawing, it was perfect. It was whole. It was complete. Judith felt the lump in her throat before she even realized it, the bittersweet ache of the past rising up in her chest. She had never realized how much she needed this, a simple, honest gesture from her grandson. "This is the real house," Max said softly, his eyes looking up at her with such tenderness that it took Judith's breath away. Her hand trembled slightly as she took the drawing, studying it for a moment. "It is, Max," she said softly. "It really is." She stood, walking over to the kitchen table where she had been unpacking earlier. She found an empty frame, small, but just the right size. Carefully, she placed the picture inside it and set it above her kitchen table, right where the light would catch it each morning. Max watched her with quiet interest, his hands tucked into his pockets. Judith turned to him, her voice steady but filled with the kind of warmth she hadn't been able to express before. "This is my real house now." Max smiled, his face softening, and Judith felt a little bit lighter. Just as she was about to speak again, the doorbell rang. It was a sharp sound, abrupt in the quiet of the evening. Judith's eyes flicked to the door, her thoughts briefly drifting back to Colby and Janelle. She stood still, waiting. The next step had begun. And whatever came next, she was ready for it. The soft warmth of the sun filtered through the windows as Judith stood in the small kitchen of her town home, the rich scent of fresh herbs and ripe tomatoes filling the air. She was preparing for her brunch, her movements slow and deliberate. The space was quiet. The only sound the occasional rustle of her apron as she sliced vegetables, her hands steady, the weight of the knife grounded in the rhythm of the moment. It was a pace she hadn't known in years. The farmer's market had been an experience in itself. The soft chatter of vendors, the deep reds and greens of fresh produce, the local honey, and flowers that seemed to capture the essence of calm. Judith had meandered from stall to stall, taking her time, enjoying the absence of rush. There were no tight schedules here. No forced smiles or fake pleasantries. Just people offering simple things, like fresh eggs or hand-woven baskets, and the kind of real smiles that reached the eyes. She returned to her kitchen table now, glancing at the simple white plates she had set with care. She had unpacked her silverware earlier that week, polished it, and laid it out like it had been for years. It was a small detail, but it mattered to her. There was a quiet joy in this. Her table, her home. It was a new beginning. Outside, the hum of the neighborhood was like music. The soft clinking of wind chimes, the distant murmur of people talking. A lawnmower somewhere in the distance. Judith sighed, her shoulders dropping in relief. This was what she had been craving. Peace. A peace that had eluded her for decades. The doorbell rang, and her heart fluttered in anticipation. She had invited a small group over for brunch. Georgia, of course, Max, and two of the neighbors she'd met since moving in. A retired couple, warm and welcoming, always with kind words. She opened the door to find Max standing there, his usual quiet self, but today, his smile was wider, more comfortable. He carried a small bouquet of wildflowers in one hand, an offering for the occasion. "Grandma," he said, his voice warm but still soft, "I thought these would look nice on the table." Judith smiled, bending down to take the flowers from him. They were simple, but the gesture was everything. She had never felt more connected to him than she did in this moment, sharing something so simple and so meaningful. "Thank you, Max," she said, taking the bouquet and placing it in a small vase on the table. She stepped back and motioned for him to come inside. "Come in. Everyone else should be here soon." Max looked around, his eyes scanning the small but cozy space. It was different from the house, but in its own way, it was home. "You look happy," he remarked, his voice soft. Judith smiled, a warmth spreading through her chest. "I am, Max. I really am." The doorbell rang again, and this time Georgia stepped inside, carrying a basket of freshly baked muffins. She grinned at Judith, her eyes filled with that knowing look. "Something smells good," Georgia said, placing the basket on the counter. "It's good to see you this way." Judith nodded, her eyes meeting her friend's with unspoken gratitude. It hadn't been easy to get here, to this place where peace felt like it belonged to her, but it was finally hers. And she wasn't going to let anyone take it away. One by one, the neighbors arrived. Joe and Marlene, the retired couple, their smiles warm and their eyes twinkling with quiet joy. Judith welcomed them in, offering them glasses of lemonade and filling the table with the simple spread she had prepared. No one was in a hurry. There were no tense conversations, no forced pleasantries. They talked easily, about the weather, about the neighborhood, about gardening and the books they'd been reading. The laughter that filled the room wasn't the sharp, strained kind from her past. It was natural, unforced, and real. Judith moved to the record player in the corner and set it to play a soft jazz album. The room filled with the comforting sounds of a piano and a saxophone, smooth and mellow. It felt like a small, perfect moment in time, a moment where nothing was wrong, and everything was as it should be. Max was sitting quietly beside her, looking at the food, his hands resting on the table. Judith could feel his gaze on her, and she glanced over at him. He smiled at her with a kind of understanding that touched something deep within her. He didn't need to say anything. She knew. She could feel the pride he held for her, quiet but solid. As the meal wrapped up and the last bits of bread were eaten, Judith sat back in her chair, feeling a rare contentment settle over her. She could hear the low hum of conversation around her, but her mind wandered for a moment. She opened the journal that sat on the table, its pages blank and ready to be filled. She grabbed the pen, poised over the page, and wrote almost without thinking. It took one shove to fix 20 years. She smiled at the words. It wasn't just about the house or the past, it was about finally owning her life. Max, who had been quietly studying the table, leaned in and whispered, "I'm proud of you, Grandma." Judith's heart swelled. She glanced at him, her voice soft as she replied, "I'm proud of you too." As the conversation continued around her, Judith sat back and let it all sink in. She had done it. She had made the move, and she had made it her own. This was the beginning of something new, something real. And as the sun dipped lower outside, casting golden light across the room, Judith realized for the first time in a long while that she was truly at peace. The sky had softened into a pale blue as Judith walked toward the house she had left behind, the one that had once meant everything and now meant nothing. It wasn't the same house anymore, not to her. The house had been sold, and in a way, it had already stopped being hers the moment she signed the papers. But there was something about standing in front of it, watching the new owners pull up in their car, that made the finality of it all sink deep into her bones. She had agreed to meet them, the young couple who had put in the offer that Judith had accepted without hesitation. They had wanted to meet her, to thank her. Judith wasn't sure why. Maybe they were curious. Maybe they felt some strange connection to her, to the history she had carried in that house. She stood at the end of the driveway now, her hands resting lightly on the fence, watching as the couple approached. They were young, no older than 30, and full of the kind of energy that only comes from starting fresh. They carried themselves with hope and anticipation, the optimism of new beginnings written in the way they held hands and smiled at each other as they crossed the yard. The woman, a tall brunette with bright eyes, was the first to speak. "You must be Judith," she said, her voice warm and full of genuine gratitude. "Thank you so much for everything. We're excited to make this our home." The man beside her, shorter, with dark hair and an easy smile, nodded. "We've been looking for the right place for a while. This feels like it's meant to be." Judith smiled back, a soft, almost imperceptible thing. There was no animosity in her. She wasn't angry anymore. She had moved on, and this meeting was a part of that. It wasn't about the house. It was about the people standing in front of her, who were making the choice to fill it with something she hadn't been able to for years. "Good luck," Judith said, her voice calm and steady, though there was a softness to it now, a quiet kind of acceptance. "It's a beautiful house. It will be a good home." The young woman smiled, her eyes lighting up. "We're really excited. We want to fill it with kindness, make it a place that feels welcoming, you know?" Judith nodded. There was no bitterness, no regret in her words. Just the simple truth that they were starting their own life in the same place she had tried to start hers. "Make your own rules," she said with a small smile, extending her hand. They both shook it, firm and kind. There was nothing left to say. The past was already gone, and this was their future now. The handshake felt like a seal, an unspoken promise that this house would mean something new, something different. It would be filled with laughter and life, with stories that hadn't been written yet. It was no longer Judith's burden to carry. As they pulled away and began walking back to their car, Judith stood still for a moment, watching them. The sun was beginning to dip lower in the sky, casting long shadows across the yard. She could hear their laughter as they climbed into the car, the sound of their voices as they drove away. It was a small thing, but it felt like the final page of a chapter being turned. Judith didn't need to watch them leave, though. She could feel it. The house was already theirs. She turned and began walking down the driveway, her steps slow but steady. The weight of the house lifted from her shoulders, and she felt lighter with every step. The porch was empty now, The curtains that had once been drawn tight against the world were gone. The windows, once clouded with the shadows of so many years, were now clear. The house had been emptied, and the echoes of her past were no longer trapped inside. Georgia was waiting for her at the end of the block, her arms crossed, a small, knowing smile on her lips. Judith stopped beside her, her gaze lingering on the house one last time. "Well, that's it," Judith said softly, her voice almost a whisper. "It's done." Georgia didn't say anything at first. She simply watched Judith, her expression unreadable. Then, with a hint of a smile, she said, "Regret anything?" Judith thought about it for a moment. The past was still there, in the memories, in the fleeting moments that had defined her. But now, with the house behind her, it was fading. "No," Judith said, her voice clear, no trace of hesitation. "Just that I didn't do it sooner." She turned and began walking with Georgia toward the street, the weight of the past lifting off her shoulders with every step. The sun dipped below the horizon, and as they walked into the cool evening air, Judith felt the last of her old life dissolve behind her. This was her future now, and she was ready for it. Judith sat at the small desk in the corner of her new townhome, the soft morning light spilling through the window and casting long shadows over the room. The house was quiet, peaceful. The kind of quiet that filled her with a sense of belonging. It was hers. And today it felt more real than it ever had before. Her hand hovered over the essay in front of her. It was a school assignment that Max had sent her just a few days earlier. She had opened it briefly, but she hadn't been able to bring herself to read it. Not until now. Not until everything had settled into place. She unfolded the pages slowly, almost reverently. The words were neat, carefully written, and the title caught her eye. "The Strength I Learned from My Grandma." Her heart fluttered in her chest as she began reading. She's not the loudest person in the room, and she doesn't argue. She doesn't have to. She doesn't yell or try to make you listen. But when she speaks, you know it's important. Judith swallowed hard. The words felt like a gentle weight pressing into her chest, and she couldn't stop herself from reading on. "She showed me what strength looks like without yelling." Max's words sank deep into her, pulling something from inside her that she hadn't expected. She had never considered herself strong in the way people often described strength: brash, loud, forceful. No, her strength had always been quieter, a steady force, a calm endurance that had carried her through the years, even when the world around her felt heavy with silence. But Max had seen it. He had seen her quiet strength. Judith's eyes blurred with tears, the soft ache of the past stirring inside her. It wasn't just the house she had let go of. It was a lifetime of moments, of effort and love that Max had witnessed, that he had somehow understood in ways she hadn't realized. She reached for the tissues on her desk, wiping her eyes, but she didn't stop reading. "She doesn't talk much about her past, but I know she's been through a lot. I've watched her work so hard to make things right, even when it wasn't easy. And she never complains." She felt her chest tighten. Max had watched her. He had seen her sacrifices, the quiet ways she had tried to keep everything together for so long. He hadn't missed it. He had seen the weight she carried, even when she hadn't shared it with him. I don't think she ever wanted to leave that old house. But she did it. She did it for herself. And that's the strongest thing I've ever seen. Judith stopped reading for a moment, her hand trembling. The tears she had been holding back fell freely now. But this time, she didn't try to stop them. She let them come, one by one, until they finally ebbed away. Max understood. He really understood. She folded the paper back up carefully, the emotions swirling in her chest like a storm she couldn't quite control. Her heart felt full in a way it hadn't in years. Max had found the words for everything she had kept hidden inside. A soft knock on the door made her look up. It was Georgia, standing in the doorway with a raised eyebrow and that familiar teasing glint in her eye. "Everything okay?" Georgia asked, stepping inside. She could tell, just from the look on Judith's face, that something had shifted. "I'm fine," Judith said, wiping her eyes again with the back of her hand, though she couldn't stop the smile that crept onto her lips. "It's just Max's essay. I wasn't expecting it." Georgia raised an eyebrow, leaning against the doorframe. "Expecting what?" "He's your grandson, Judith. He looks up to you more than you know." Judith nodded, glancing down at the essay once more, the ink now smudged with the traces of her tears. "I didn't realize how much he understood. How much he saw." Georgia stepped into the room and sat beside her. She leaned over and gently picked up the essay, glancing at it with quiet appreciation. "You should frame it. You've earned it. Keep it somewhere you can see it every day." Judith smiled softly, the idea sinking in. She had never thought of framing a piece of paper, but something about this felt right. Something about this was a reminder of the journey she'd taken and how far she had come. "I think I will," Judith said, her voice soft, as she folded the essay carefully and set it aside. "It's the kind of thing I'll want to look at when I forget." Georgia gave a small nod, her smile soft and knowing. "You won't forget." Later that afternoon, as the sun began to set and the soft glow of evening filled the townhome, Judith stood in the small living room. She found a frame tucked away in one of the boxes she had just unpacked, one that was simple but elegant. She placed Max's essay in it and set it on the mantel, right next to the drawing he had made of the house. The light caught both pieces in a way that made the room feel even more like home. Max had given her a gift with those words, a reminder that everything she had done, every hard choice, every moment of quiet strength, had been seen. He had seen her. The doorbell rang again, but Judith didn't move to answer it right away. She stood still for a moment, looking at the essay and the drawing. It was a reminder that no matter how far she had come, she wasn't alone. Max's voice floated through the door, and a soft smile tugged at Judith's lips. When she opened it, he was standing there, holding a small suitcase, his eyes wide with hope. "Can I come next weekend too?" he asked quietly, as though the answer wasn't already written in the way he looked at her. Judith reached out and pulled him into a hug, her heart swelling with love. "Of course you can," she said, the words full of warmth and quiet certainty. "You can come every weekend. You earned your seat." She led him inside, the soft hum of their voices filling the space as she closed the door behind them, and for the first time in so many years, Judith felt a full and complete sense of peace settle around her. This was her real home now. This was where she belonged. The morning sunlight poured through the window, spilling across the kitchen floor in golden swaths. Judith stood at the counter, her hands moving slowly but steadily, as though every motion was an affirmation of something she hadn't realized she needed to do. The familiar smell of flour and butter filled the air, pulling her back to memories of Colby. His voice rising with laughter at the dinner table, the way he'd devoured every biscuit she made, always asking for more. She stirred the dough carefully, a ritual she had performed countless times before. But today, there was no Colby to appreciate them. There was no family around the table, no laughter to fill the space. Judith rolled the dough onto the counter, cutting out round shapes, the warm, homey scent now rising to meet her. She could almost hear Colby's voice in her mind, the playful teasing, the way he'd always expect the biscuits to be fresh and warm, like it was something she owed him. Her hand trembled slightly as she placed the tray in the oven. She wasn't going to keep this old habit alive for him. She wasn't going to keep feeding ghosts. She had already let go of the house. It wasn't for him anymore. The biscuits baked in silence, and Judith allowed herself a moment of reflection. Her new home, Small, tidy, filled with light, felt like a blank page. She had arrived here with nothing but the weight of her past and the hope that this would be different. And in many ways, it already was. When the biscuits were done, Judith carefully slid the tray from the oven. The golden brown color of them was perfect, but the warmth in her chest was something different. It was the warmth of moving forward. She picked up half of the tray and wrapped them in a cloth, placing them in a small box. This was for Max. The rest, she threw away. For the first time, there was no hesitation. No lingering guilt about the wasted food. No second-guessing herself. She was letting go of the past piece by piece. Max would arrive later, bringing with him his quiet presence, his steady understanding. Judith smiled at the thought of him. He had been the one constant through all the upheaval, the one person who had never let her down. And as she made her way to the window, coffee cup in hand, she realized how much she had come to rely on him. Sitting down at the table by the window, she let the warmth of the sun wash over her. The world outside her little town home felt like a distant hum, far away from the storm she had weathered. She looked down at the coffee cup, tracing the rim with her finger. She felt calm, peaceful. The sound of birds chirping outside. The occasional hum of a car passing by. It was different here. It was quieter. As Judith sipped her coffee, she heard the ping of an email notification. She picked up her phone, the sleek black screen lighting up in her hands. It was from Reed. The final wire confirmation. The home was officially closed. Her name had been removed from the deed. She felt a strange release in her chest as she read the email. The weight of it all. The years of frustration, the countless moments of silence, the anger she had held onto for so long, seemed to slip away in an instant. The house was no longer hers. It belonged to someone else now. The past had been sold, the chapters turned, and the pages no longer stuck together. Judith sat back in her chair, her hands resting on the table. She had done it. She had pushed the sale through, just as she had planned, and now there was nothing left to tie her to that place. There was a soft knock at the door, followed by the familiar voice of Georgia calling from the hallway. "Judith, are you ready?" Judith took a deep breath and smiled to herself. She was. She had been ready for a long time, even when she hadn't known it. But now, as the sun filtered through the window, the new house felt more like a home with every passing moment. She stood up, placing her coffee cup down on the counter and crossing the room to the door. As she opened it, she saw Georgia standing there, a glass of wine in her hand, her smile wide and proud. "To clean exits?" Georgia said, raising her glass. Her eyes were filled with quiet satisfaction, the kind that only comes from watching a friend finally set themselves free. Judith took the glass from her, raising it in kind. "To boundaries with walls and a sale price," she said, her voice clear and steady, her smile reaching her eyes. The two women clinked glasses, the sound of it ringing through the air like the closing of a door. It wasn't the end of the story, but it was the end of the chapter. And it felt right. Judith stood in the doorway, looking out at the street, at her new life waiting just beyond the threshold. The house she had let go of was gone, but she was still here, stronger than she had been before, with nothing left but the future. A future she was finally ready to claim. "My son shoved me while guests laughed," she whispered to herself, a small smile curling on her lips. "So I pushed the house sale through that night." The door was closed, and she was free.